Welcome to any viewers. I'm just going to be sitting in silence and taking any questions in the chat window when they come up, and I will answer them. Anything on non-duality, Advaita, spirituality, and specifically sort of my specialty is self-inquiry, Sri Ramana Maharishi's signature method for reaching the self. But he often said that simply sitting in silence is an incredibly powerful means of staying as truth. So that's what I'll be doing in between questions for the next 2 hours. So feel free to join me in that, or if you have a question, ask. Or as many questions as you have. So the first question is, would you say there is any value in specifically exploring body sensations, perceptions, and emotions or objective experience, or would you say only self-inquiry is needed for realization? So there is value in exploring body sensations, perceptions, and emotions and objective experience generally for a couple of reasons. So in order to perform self-inquiry or the spiritual search, you have to have a relatively pure mind. What is a pure mind? It means a mind that is relatively quiet, that is able to concentrate, and that has the desire for the spiritual search. And that desire has to be strong, it has to be pure. And you can't force yourself to have that desire. That desire comes automatically as the result of essentially having become more honest with yourself about your own emotions and desires over time. So I actually recommend to pretty much all intelligent seekers that they do engage with their emotions, and there are many different ways of doing that. One of them is, for example, psychoanalytic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, which I constantly recommend because it's a way of engaging with your unconscious emotions that you may not be able to deal with on your own. But there are other ways of going about it. But absolutely, you have to become more honest about your own desires, and that does require an engagement with the emotions. As far as body sensations and things like that, it depends. If those are things which you are honestly, genuinely interested in, then you should respect your desires and pursue those desires until which point you stop being interested in them, or they evolve into something else. Basically, the spiritual search is becoming more honest with yourself. And it starts with emotional honesty. And there's a great passage, in fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, which says the person who simply denies themselves what they want while inwardly really wanting it, that person is a hypocrite. So, yes, engage with the world, engage with your emotions to the extent that you want it, while keeping in mind the spiritual search. And no one says these things can't all be done at the same time. And you'll find yourself evolving more and more towards self-inquiry in the end, which is, that's the spear tip that leads to the cutting of the veil of ignorance for sure. But you need to prepare your mind, purify it first through a process of emotional honesty, and also through getting an appropriate intellectual framework. Did that answer your question? Okay, great. Next question. What are the most common seeker mistakes? It's a great question. Well, one of them, I think, is precisely not paying attention to their emotions and to the emotional and psychological work that's necessary, and to ignoring the unconscious. So just like I just said, go into psychoanalytic psychotherapy, deal with your unconscious issues. I did this myself as a seeker for many years, and it was critically important, because if you do not deal with your unconscious psychological issues, they will sabotage your spiritual seeking. So that's one big mistake seekers make. They just try to jump to the spiritual. I mean, some people can do it. If they already have a sufficiently pure mind, they can, quote unquote, jump to the spiritual. And if they have a strong desire for that, go for it. But for many, many people, they're in denial about various unconscious psychological issues they have. So that's one big mistake. Another big mistake, I think, is seekers do not pay enough attention, I think, to the ancient knowledge about spirituality that has been accumulated. They look only at modern teachers. They do not read any of the ancient scriptures. And I am not a traditionalist. I don't believe in rigid adherence to, some particular ancient tradition. But there's no question that the ancient scriptures have immense wisdom that you are really losing out on a seeker if you don't read. You don't have to read it all, but pick a particular tradition that resonates with you. If it's Buddhism. If it's Vedanta, I'm a Vedantin, then Vedanta. But read the ancient scriptures and engage with them, because they're immensely powerful. That's another mistake seekers make, is they don't look at the past. They don't look at the scriptures. That's the treasury of wisdom. What else? Another mistake seekers commonly make is they get wrapped up into intellectualizing too much about what the enlightened state is and what it means to be enlightened. There's nothing wrong with some amount of intellectualization and some amount of philosophy, and for a lot of people, including myself, you need that for a while, but it can become a trap. Because the reality is that the final truth of enlightenment is beyond the ability of the mind to comprehend. That doesn't mean it's some spectacular fireworks mystical experience, although it is in a way mind-blowing, but that it is the boundary between mind and no mind. And the reality is that the mind will never be able to comprehend it, and if the mind wants to completely make it logical, it's never going to succeed, and the seeker is just going to run themselves around in circles for a very long time. So that's another common mistake seekers make, is trying to completely rationalize the entire process, the enlightened state, the total metaphysics. It's rational to a point. You can get a big picture, you can get rational enough. But if you really try to fully comprehend it, you will run into paradox. If you then use that to turn inward, that's great. But a lot of seekers just stay there trying and trying and trying to understand what really cannot be understood with the mind. So those are some common mistakes seekers make that just came to mind. So another question. How important is it to become convinced that the materialist worldview is false? Any thoughts I have regarding materialism would be great. So, this is a great question. My belief is you have to be pretty convinced that the materialist worldview is false. You don't necessarily have to be convinced about an alternative worldview exactly about what the quote-unquote true worldview is, but I think if you're fundamentally a materialist, you're going to have some difficulty in having sufficient faith in what is beyond the mind. You see, what we're talking about is beyond the mind. Materialism doesn't really admit of a beyond the mind. You know, they can say it's a neurological state or something like that, but it's not the same thing. You have to have some faith in an instrument of knowing that is not something that we can speak about or know using conventional means. And if you don't have sufficient faith in that, I think it's going to be difficult to drive yourself to that point where you can see clearly. So, yeah. And I thought about this back and forth at times, and I'm not absolutely 100% sure, to be honest, but I'm 98% sure that a materialist worldview is kind of a bar to progress, and you need to really sort of at least break materialism. You don't necessarily have to embrace anything else particularly, although I certainly embrace God. I believe in the divine. I think if you do have a resonance with the divine, then you should definitely go towards it. It's very helpful. But if you really believe in strict materialism, I think it's going to be difficult, is my impression. Did that answer your question? So how to break materialism then? Well, it's a good question. I think it probably depends on the particular person. So some people are more ingrained in it than others, and different arguments will appeal to different people. So I feel like the materialist who wants to break materialism is going to have to look at their own particular assumptions. So for example, this is not an argument that I'm very familiar with, but it certainly persuades some people. Some people are persuaded against materialism by looking at all the stuff about quantum physics in detail, and if they read up on it, they're convinced that the materialist interpretations of quantum physics don't hold water. And that's something that definitely has persuaded some people. Personally, what persuaded me, and it persuades some people that I speak to, but not everybody, is the question of consciousness. It's the consciousness. I don't see how materialism is going to account for consciousness. So the example that I use for this, which again, not everybody agrees with, but I found it persuasive enough, is so there's a whole branch of philosophy that deals with the body, the body-mind connection, right? How is it that the brain and the body in a materialist paradigm are going to account for consciousness, right? This has been dealt with and is still a hot topic in philosophy. And there are a lot of thought experiments that regard it, like famously, for example, this philosopher named David Chalmers talked about the idea of philosophical zombies, which are, imagine a person who is identical, at a molecular level with you or me, body-wise, but they have no inner experience. Would there be any way of telling, from their body, whether that was the case or not? So I mean, he says there isn't. That destroys materialism, he says. I don't know that's necessarily the most intuitive or persuasive example, but I'll give you an example that I think is fairly persuasive, and it's fairly simple. And again, not everyone will agree, but I'll put this out there, and it's the example I used in my book, and it's called spectrum inversion. So the idea is, imagine that you and I had our colors inverted, right? Or one of us did with respect to the other, right? So for example, when I looked at snow, I saw the color that you saw when you looked at, a new moon sky with no clouds, right? Like pitch black, right? So my snow is pitch black, and similarly for all the colors, right? They're all inverted. Now, if we both used the same color words to refer to things, right? So we both called the snow white, but my experience of the color of that snow is radically different than your experience of it, even though we use the same word. The question is, would science be able to tell? Materialism basically depends on the idea that everything that's out there is something which is scientifically accessible through the senses, right? Scientists should be able to come to agreement on what is going on by examining matter through their instruments. Now, the way that all the brain studies work has been done today is, you have MRI machines and fMRI machines and various other kinds of scanners, but it's all correlated to experience that is talked about in terms of words. So words are considered the definitive window into somebody's inner experience. So if we're using the same word or words to describe our color experiences, we both call grass green, we both call water blue, we both call clouds white, right? We both call tar black, but our inner experiences are different. If we're using the color words consistently, even though our different inner experiences are different, is there any way to tell? And the answer is there isn't, because you could have the most sophisticated scientific instruments look into our brains, and even if they found that my brain was different than your brain, how would they know what it meant? Because we use the words in the same way. Even if they could have a television hooked up to my brain to show a picture, a supposed picture of what it is that I'm seeing, and they put it on a TV screen, the question is, someone would have to look at that TV screen, and what is their inner experience of colors, right? So the inner experience is hidden behind the word. We have no idea whether someone else means by white what we mean by white. All we know is that they use it in the same consistent set of circumstances, and there's no way, even theoretically, for scientists to ever penetrate this, because they could have access to the atom, they could have access to the molecules, they could have access to the most sophisticated science that looks into the matter of the brain and the body. but they would always have to keep correlating it with words to understand what the inner experience is. And two people using the same word to refer to the same phenomena could have completely different inner experiences, and there would be no way to tell. So what this means is, if you buy this thought experiment, which I do, is that there is something which cannot be accounted for through the scientific examination of matter. And if there's something that cannot be accounted for through the scientific examination of matter, that something being our conscious experience, that is literally what we're having every second of every day, then materialism must be wrong. Now, materialism could be a very useful framework for a lot of subjects and inquiries, but if there is something which materialism and scientific examination of matter cannot account for, then that breaks materialism. It means materialism can't be true. It doesn't necessarily mean some other worldview is true, but it means materialism isn't true. Now, does that make sense as an example? Do you have any? I'm sure you probably have some question about that, but that's, to me, it seems to be a sort of the simplest example that I can come up with that people seem to resonate with and respond to as to why there is a theoretical reason that materialism cannot be true, because it cannot account for our inner experience fully. It cannot penetrate behind someone's mind and see what their inner movie is directly. We have to rely on what they say about it. And if people are talking about their experience in the same way, we have no idea what those words actually mean. We'd have to be them to know what those words actually meant. We can't actually occupy their inner movie directly. And even if we were looking somehow at their movie, it would be us looking at their movie. To eliminate the fact of our own observation and be them directly is not something that science can do. Can't do it now. There's no even theoretical way for it to do it, because we're locked in our own observational inner movies. We can't see someone else's inner movie directly. Now, does that make any sense? So paranormal phenomena, siddhis, etc., do those bear on things? They certainly might. I don't have enough knowledge about those particular arguments. Do I believe that paranormal phenomena exist if we define paranormal phenomena as being outside what science currently considers to be valid? 100%, yes, I certainly believe that. But which exactly phenomena? And how do they work, and what is their status? I couldn't really say. I do agree, though, that for some people, those kinds of arguments are what works. And I feel like it's a very individualized thing, right? Each person has to look at their own particular doubts and examine them, rationally and logically. So, yes. The thing is, the scientists would simply say, with some justification, right, that even if there were paranormal phenomena and siddhis and whatnot, they would say, oh, that's, science just hasn't gotten there yet, right? So they would say, it just means science has to expand to include them. So really, to break materialism, I think you have to have something which science cannot expand to, which is consciousness, right? The inner movie that's individual to a particular person can never be the subject, the object, rather, I should say, of examination, right? Subjectivity itself can never be the direct object of examination, because anyone examining it has their own subjectivity, right? That's interfering with the ability to examine someone else's subjectivity. So I think that's why it might be superior to go that route than the siddhi paranormal route. But I don't know. For some people, I think what matters is that you get to that state of openness to the inner exploration. That's what matters, right? That you have some faith that, okay, materialism and science isn't the end-all, be-all. It doesn't contain all possible truth. That there is at least the possibility, the plausibility of an inner route to truth. That's what I think. That's the state of mind you have to be in. And if you could, if you are drawn, though, if you of course are drawn to God or anything like that, I mean, again, I highly encourage that. But I don't think it's absolutely necessary. You just have to be open enough to the possibility of something called inner exploration, which goes beyond the scientific materialist means of seeking truth. So a question about what is my view on the existence of free will? That's a great question. So it's tricky. So I would say, from the seeker's standpoint, it's important to believe that there is enough free will to conduct the search. So there is enough free will for that. At the same time, I think the seeker also has to bear in mind that the entire manifested universe is essentially beyond the control of who they think they are. So I think we can say that there's enough free will to pursue the search, but beyond that, there really is no free will. Now, if you want to question me and say, well, how is there even enough free will to conduct the search? I would then say, well, look into who's asking. Because the real truth of the matter is, neither free will nor predetermination or any non-free will view is exactly true. I mean, probably the closest you get to truth in words is to say that everything is the will of the cosmic intelligence or something like that, if you want to put it that way. But the real reality is that the very concepts, the very opposition of free will and not free will are mental categories, and that self-realization or enlightenment is the revelation that all these mental categories are false, that they take place against a background of silence that goes beyond them. And so you can't be cabined into this question of free will or not free will. Both are wrong. But, I would say, from the seeker's point of view, as I said, treat yourself as if there's enough free will to take the search on, and view everything else as the will of the universe or the will of God, or if you prefer, karma. I mean, some people like that concept. That also is merely a relative provisional concept. It's not a finally real concept. Does that answer your question? So the question is free will for no one? Well, if by no one you mean the true self is beyond all concepts, like I said. So I would say you couldn't even ascribe free will to no one. No one is beyond free will or no free will. I know it's popular to think, you can think it if you want, honestly, is the reality. I mean, whatever helps you in a sense. I take a sort of pragmatic view of metaphysics that way. But, the truth is that the truth is beyond all concepts. There's no individual to have free will. How can it exist? Well, that may be true. If you believe yourself to be an individual, and be honest with yourself about that, if you believe yourself to be suffering, if you believe yourself to be searching, if you believe yourself to be seeking, then you believe yourself to be an individual. It's not something that's just a choice you can make. You actually have to examine what it is you really believe, and not just tell yourself you believe something like, oh, I'm not an individual, when you really don't. But if you believe yourself to be an individual, I don't want to put seekers in a state where they feel paralyzed to act. If you believe yourself to be an individual, then you do have enough free will to look within. You are right that if there's no real individual, how could there be free will? You're right, there couldn't be. But that shouldn't be just something that you believe because you've heard it. look within, and then you'll see precisely what is meant by that, right? You shouldn't just take it as words. It should be a direct perception, right? That's beyond words. Otherwise, it's going to be misunderstood. So, a question about any thoughts on spiritual transmission. Is this necessary? Must it take place in physical proximity with a teacher? Spiritual transmission is not necessary. You have an inner teacher. That is the only spiritual transmission that's required. If you look within, and in fact, the very idea, the very desire, the very notion, even if it's fleeting, that I should look within, that I should see beyond what I currently believe is the case, is already a transmission by grace, because many, many people never have that thought occur to them, never had that desire arise. So the very arising of that desire, even for a second, even in its weakest form, is already a transmission from your inner guru. That said, can a physical guru be helpful? Can a physical place be helpful? Sure, they can, at times. Yes, they can give vibrational influences, let's say, that help calm your mind, but they're not absolutely required by any means. And by the way, I should say one more thing. If it's, if there's such a transmission, I don't believe it need be physical either. It could be any number of ways, right? You have all kinds of ways of being in contact with a teacher. That's why, for example, in Hinduism, you have the whole concept of temples and idols. You don't necessarily have to be, at only one location, right? There are many different radiations of that presence, and there's the whole world is non-physical. So to believe that there's something special about being in quote unquote physical proximity is wrong. But it is as each person has, it is according to each person's belief, right? So if someone believes that a physical presence is required, then for them it may be required because that's their deep-seated belief. So the question is, do I think retreats for self-inquiry are helpful? How would I advise to set these up? Sitting all day, concentration exercises also, any ideas? So retreats can be helpful at the beginning if you want, in order to get the basics down, acquire some concentration. But the reality is that very quickly, if you want to do self-inquiry seriously, you're going to have to take it into the real world. That this is going to have to be something that you pursue eventually every waking moment, to every thought, to every feeling, to every decision, to every dissatisfaction. You turn the mind from the object of its attention to the one who is aware of that object. So retreats could be useful at the very start, like I say, because at the very beginning, people might need a little bit of dedicated instruction and a little bit of time to build up some concentration. But self-inquiry is not basically a retreat tool. Self-inquiry is fundamentally a complete reorientation of where your attention is, right? From instead of looking out there, and when I say out there, I include the mind itself as out there, to looking inward. And it has to be done all the time. So yeah, a retreat can maybe kickstart the process. And if that was going to be the case, I think exactly what would happen would depend on the precise group of people that you were dealing with. It could be sitting all day. I mean, other kinds of concentration exercises that are there, could be used again in preparation if people wanted them. Although self-inquiry is itself a concentration exercise, right? It's just the best one because it's not merely about concentration. It's also about looking relentlessly at this fundamental concept, that's so subtle that we can't even see that it's built up our entire worldview, which is this concept of the I, or the one who is aware. So that is a concentration tool, but some people may need other kinds of concentration exercises to begin with. They concentrate on the breath or things like that. And if they need that as a preliminary, that's fine. Again, I think it depends on the particular group of people that we're talking about. So does that make sense? Yeah, Ramana Maharshi's general standpoint on these things was, people of different temperaments needed to acquire concentration in different ways. So for some people, he would say if they felt the need to chant a mantra or to focus on their breath or things like that, go right ahead and do it. By any means possible, acquire concentration. But eventually, all of that concentration will have to funnel finally into self-inquiry, which is, it's not really a practice. It's just a looking within, right? It's holding this riddle. It's holding the riddle of the obvious in your hand and focusing your attention on it night and day. He would occasionally mention these other exercises, or for some people who would only respond or resonate with them, he would mention them. They'll eventually, they'll come to self-inquiry at some point, whether in this lifetime or another. So another question, any thoughts on doing self-inquiry while experiencing addiction? In a way, everyone is addicted, whether or not it's a quote-unquote typical addiction to what we think of as things to be addicted to. We're all, if we are seekers, addicted to pleasure, avoiding pain, bolstering our self-image, right? Those are our addictions. So in a way, we are dealing with those addictions. My general sense about things, as I've already said, is to some extent these kinds of addictions, if they interfere with your ability to focus on the spiritual search, which to some extent they will for everybody, try to rein them in through a practice which gets you in touch with your emotions and your real desires, but become more emotionally honest. That is the key thing, right? So if you are going to be addicted to something, try to be ultimately honest about your reasons for doing so, right? Rather than telling yourself, let's say, for example, and it may require work to get to this point, but people talk about how, an addict may go from feeling that their addiction is an outside force that is imposed upon them, right? To feeling like, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do, and I wholeheartedly do it with my complete being, to feel that they have taken ownership in some sense of the addiction is itself a huge step in emotional honesty, and that may be what moves things forward. So it's more complicated than simply saying, don't do it. I'm not a moralizer that way, and I think that's in fact counterproductive. Everyone is dealing with addiction in some general sense in the spiritual search. Every seeker. If you have specific addictions that need, particular attention, I'm all for therapy. But again, I'm all for therapy for all seekers, right? Psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So addiction is really not that different, I would say, although there might be some exceptions, if that makes sense. Yes. So get your house in order in terms of honesty, I would say, more than anything, more than quelling addictions or anything like that. Be honest about what it is that you want, even if it is what society says, oh, it's wrong. If you're honest about wanting it, that is what's going to move you forward. And of course, obviously honesty can mean having conflicted or conflictual desires. And if that's the case, bring all of them to the surface. Let all of them have voice. And maybe if all of them have voice, there could be a new synthesis that really takes them all into account. And that's what needs to happen. So Barry says, just to say I loved your book, gave the best practical instruction on how to do self-inquiry. You say that inquiry should become a 24-hour practice, but I do find that difficult to carry out for extended time. How long might that process take? Days, months, or years? So Barry, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book and found it helpful. So yes, inquiry is difficult to carry out for an extended period of time because it can become exhausting, which is why at a certain point you might attempt to alternate it with various surrender practices, which I also mentioned in my book. But basically surrender is this idea that you just give up. Give up all mental effort. Give up all desire-based action. Just sort of mentally go slack, right? And that can be something which can have multiple functions. Surrender can be an incredibly powerful tool for getting to the truth directly, actually. Or it can be something that refreshes you in periods when self-inquiry has gotten too exhausting, right? So self-inquiry goes for a while, and then maybe you're like, I'm just too tired, I can't do it anymore. And then you surrender, and that goes for a while. But then at a certain point after surrender, you might be, of course your surrender can't be perfect, right? Perfect surrender is not possible as a seeker. You can only have partial surrender. Partial surrender is itself very powerful because it will lead you in deeper and deeper into it. But at a certain point, you may say, who is the one who is surrendering? And that brings you back to self-inquiry, right? And so you might go back and forth like this for a while. Or you might find that self-inquiry becomes easier and easier after a certain time of doing it because practice will make it easier. So those are all considerations. As for how long it takes, no time limit can be given. It might take the rest of your life. You have to want it enough, because it's not a process exactly by which, it's not a systematic process exactly. I mean, there are elements of it which are systematic. Like there's an idea that you're in a way reprogramming your mind away from attending to objects in the world to attending to inside, right? And if you can discover in the process of self-inquiry, which you will discover in the process of self-inquiry, an inner peace, and your mind touches that peace, which I call in my book the spacious mind, right? If you get a glimpse of the truth that the I is not what you think it is at all, but something completely different, right? Your whole concept of the I is wrong, right? If you get a glimpse of that, you'll want to get back there, right? And you'll get back there for longer and longer periods, right? Your self-inquiry you'll be automatically motivated to get there. So that's what I would say. If it becomes too difficult, attempt to surrender for a while, and go with that, because surrender is the effortless way. And in fact, in a way, self-inquiry will lead inevitably to surrender one way or the other. But you have to want it enough that you give it an indefinite period of time. Practice cannot be cabined, right? The practice is the reward, and you have to be willing to give up your notions of control and saying, oh, it's going to be done for this amount of time. No. Surrender and self-inquiry are indefinite periods of time. If you want the truth, you have to let go of timelines. But you will be rewarded for your devotion. It's worth it. Is what I would say. There's nothing higher. There's no higher goal. So another question: have you experienced some form of samadhi, and if so, could you describe it, and how has it changed your body, mind, and your behavior after? So it's a tricky question to answer, because what one considers to be samadhi depends upon what one identifies oneself with. So for a seeker, samadhi simply means an absorption of mind. It can happen in many, many different circumstances. And so we've all experienced samadhi to some extent. And there are samadhis that, of course, are the result of deep, sitting down, closed-eyed, meditative states. There's samadhis that can be acquired that way, but there are samadhis that can be acquired in much simpler ways as well, right? Ramana Maharshi talks about that moment you have, that many of us have had at least at some point in our lives, if not many times in our lives, when you wake up. And you wake up and it's just before you remember anything, before you remember who you are, before you remember where you are, before the whole sort of structure of memory descends on you. There is that moment of like blankness. That's samadhi. If you become absorbed in an activity with intense concentration and you lose track of everything else and time seems to stop and you sort of just are completely that's samadhi. So there are many different kinds of samadhi. It depends on the context we're talking about. And samadhi in itself is not of incredible spiritual importance, except inasmuch as it helps you see that there might be something more than your usual way of looking at things, right? That self-inquiry does result in, you could say, kinds of samadhi states to some extent. But those states aren't really the important thing. The important thing is the fact that they are showing you that your usual way of looking at the world is wrong. So ultimately what we want is to move the idea of samadhi from this idea of a state that you acquire as a result of certain meditative practices or certain activities to the realization that samadhi is actually your constant, continuous nature. This is what Ramana Maharshi called sahaja samadhi, natural samadhi, continuous samadhi. This is the samadhi that's of real value. It's the samadhi, in fact, that you are experiencing right this second. But it doesn't seem like you're experiencing it. Now, why doesn't it seem like you're experiencing it? Because of a thought that identifies yourself with the body and mind. That thought is called ignorance. That thought is what veils the natural fact of continuous samadhi. Actually, if you penetrate that thought, you will find that it never actually even veiled it. The very idea of a veil is not even possible. It's just the thought of a veil, actually. It's the thought of somebody who's afflicted by ignorance. There's no such person, actually. No one has ever been afflicted by ignorance. What you are is already the case. You are already in a state of samadhi right now. And if you pursue self-inquiry, you will see that there's never a case, there's never a time when you weren't in natural samadhi. That's the true samadhi. Everything else is a relative, provisional, temporary samadhi that's not of great value, except in as much as it helps open your mind a little bit as a seeker. And when you are acquainted with the natural, true samadhi, what you see is you have a question about how to change your body, mind, and behavior after. Those things can't be. Those things are all seen to be false concepts, actually. So this is why the state of a quote-unquote enlightened being, quote-unquote, because that very notion is in a way wrong, cannot ever be described in words. So the question is, why does ignorance arise? A great question, a classic question, actually. And the classic answer is, does ignorance arise? The very idea that ignorance arises is itself ignorance. I know that seems, of course, paradoxical. It is paradoxical and gibberish from the mental point of view. But the reality is that that's the nature of ignorance. It is very, very mysterious and twisty. And as soon as you look for what its root is, it will be found to be wholly and utterly non-existent. Not just now, but forever. Right? It never existed. Ignorance never arose, right? But what does that mean? What does that mean? You know, just hearing those words is insufficient, right? There is a direct seeing, of course, which will resolve that question. But the basic answer is ignorance never arose. The very idea that ignorance arose is ignorance. So the question is, did I ever experience any conflict between psychoanalysis and the spiritual path? Not really, no. I will say that, my analyst doesn't necessarily understand everything about the spiritual path, but it doesn't matter because she respects it and views it from an analytic perspective as part of my activities as a human being. So it doesn't really matter that she understands necessarily all the nuances, so long as she takes a respectful attitude towards it, basically. And certainly, it's also an object for analysis, meaning, why am I interested in spirituality? Why is anybody interested in spirituality? It's often because of what's happened to them growing up, right? The particular conditions led to that interest. So that's nothing wrong with looking at that, actually, and it can be helpful. I don't see any other great conflict, that happened, in my analysis at least. There might be a few people who are bad apples as analysts, who would press their own anti-spiritual viewpoint on people, perhaps, or something like that. That would be very, very small percentage, I think. And there might be bad therapists, regardless, doing all kinds of bad things, but they're very few. Generally speaking, I don't think it's going to be a problem. And no, if anything, analysis was hugely helpful to my spiritual path because it allowed me to clear away certain unconscious obstacles, to gain confidence in my own path, to go my own direction, in a way that I didn't know that I could, and didn't, to see hindrances to my going in that direction that I couldn't have seen on my own, and also to provide a certain kind of empathic, and this is linked to it, a certain kind of nurturing, empathic relationship that that I think was very helpful for me. I think would be helpful for a lot of people. But, if one does enter analysis and perceives a conflict between analysis and the spiritual path, I think that's a ripe object to bring into the analysis as something that you then discuss with the analyst. It could say something about your own psychology if you happen to perceive that kind of conflict. And that's what analysis is all about, is bringing those kinds of conflicts into the room so they can then be sort of discussed and processed, articulated mutually. So the question is, what are my thoughts about food and nutrition? Did my spiritual realization have any effect on my diet? So my general thoughts on food and nutrition, I'm not an extreme expert on any of it, but is pick that diet which is basically going to aid you in your concentration and the purity of your mind, which basically means don't eat too much, don't eat too little, although fasting can be helpful in certain cases, I think. And know your own body, right? Listen to your own body, right? I think I would go with the common sense recommendations, right? Don't eat too much processed food, don't eat too many refined sugars, right? At the same time, I would also say, if you are drawn, for example, to junk food or things like that, there are probably psychological reasons for it. And it's important to come to terms with what those reasons are. If you find yourself binge eating, if you find yourself drawn to unhealthy foods time and time again, chronically in a way that you can't control, then time to go to therapy, time to go to psychoanalytic psychotherapy and investigate what those conditions are, because it's not going to be helpful to simply bring a tyrannical fist down and force yourself against it. That's not going to be helpful. There are messages that kind of behavior is sending you. You need to listen to what those messages are. I think that's important. Now, as far as what spiritual realization had in terms of an effect on my diet, I think probably it may be somewhat less attached to junk food and sweets because, you know, once one is in touch with a source of inner peace, right, naturally other cravings decrease, generally speaking. I mean, there's still, I quote, if I'm identifying myself with the body and mind, which is not really accurate, I would say, sure, of course I still have a sweet tooth to some extent, but it's not the same character it was before where maybe at certain points in my life it was driven by craving, and now it's really not so much driven by craving for the most part. It's sort of a weak preference that remains. So that may be how it altered things. It probably altered things for the healthier, generally speaking. Although my diet's not perfect by any means, I think. But it's not bad. Did that answer your question? Any thoughts about meat? Well, I'm a vegetarian, but that wasn't necessarily because of spirituality. It's because I grew up that way, more or less. Um, well, I mean, there are different perspectives on meat in the spiritual search, right? So traditionally, Hinduism would say meat promotes qualities of mind like aggression, increased sexual desire that are inimical to the spiritual search, that it's better to refrain for that reason because it will make your search easier. Your mind will be clearer, everything will be simpler if you avoid things like meat. Um, but I think the reality is that may be too simple a perspective, and some people have grown up with it, their temperament is around it. I mean, I think for ethical reasons, there's certainly very good arguments against meat, and especially factory farmed meat. Um, but again, the world is complex. People are complex. Some people have needs for it. For example, some people have nutritional requirements that can't be met in any other way but meat, or at least not easily. Some people live in parts of the world where, meat is the main source of food, and if they didn't eat meat, it would be very, very difficult for them. So I think you have to kind of look at your own circumstances and see, in your particular case, is eating meat something that's going to further your own purity of mind or not. But as a general rule, would I say for a seeker, if they can decrease or eliminate it? Sure. I mean, I think it's a great idea. But I wouldn't lay down a blanket law. Of course. question about do I avoid alcohol? I do not. I drink socially. Um, yeah, I mean, whether or not alcohol should be avoided is again a matter of temperament, which should be decided by each particular person. Traditionally, yes, Hinduism would say for seekers they should avoid it because alcohol can have these um, effects on mental concentration that are they're going to make it harder to search. Do I think that's something that's a blanket rule applicable to today's world? Not necessarily, but if one can refrain, if one feels like completely refraining, that's probably a good thing for a seeker. But I think it's important to be flexible and look at the overall situation. I believe in that more than rigid rules. The question is about the fact that I recommend Proust. Can I say something about what it's done for me? So yes, it's an unusual recommendation for a spiritual website. Proust was a very crucial link for me in my search. Not necessarily the very end of it, but there was a point in my search when I was suffering, and I didn't just want to remove the suffering. I think this is the case for everybody actually, but I wanted the suffering to be meaningful somehow. And I wanted to understand its meaning. And reading Proust, I mean, it's not necessary to read him to get this, is the truth, but reading him has a lot of rewards to it. I mean, he's very beautiful, very, very beautiful writer, although it requires a lot of concentration to get through, but he's one of the greatest novelists of all time, if not the greatest. But he had a philosophy which was illustrated in his books, and which he also talked about at the end of them, whereby art and literature, generally, were the means by which you could transform experiences of suffering into experiences of beauty and meaning. And the reason that was so, which is something he hinted at in his books or talked about, but maybe not in complete clarity, is that our experiences of suffering and pain are very reflective of our particular individual perspectives. And those perspectives are unique to us. And in a way, those experiences of suffering would only occur in the way they occurred to us, given our history, given our perspective, given our individual view of the world. And that when you attempt to take those experiences of suffering and depict what it's like to experience them in very sensitive, original terms that really are true to your own emotional experience of that experience of suffering, you'll sort of unfurl this complexity in the experience, the structure to it. And the structure is beautiful, even if the experience was painful. The structure of it was beautiful, and the structure of it is your own individual perspective. Now, this is not the classical non-dual spiritual concern, but it was important to me, and I think it will be important to many people, because it provides a certain bridge or link when the seeker needs to make their suffering experiences meaningful and beautiful. And if they can't proceed without that, they can turn to art and literature, to creating it themselves out of their own experiences of pain, as a way of bridging that gap. And they will find that there is beauty that comes out of it. It is not by itself the final beauty of the spirit, although it's actually very linked to it, because the final beauty of the spirit, the final beauty of the self, is in a sense nothing other than a continuous experience of artistic beauty in every moment. So there is a link for sure. But, this process, which in my books I call metaphorization, which is, why is it called metaphorization? Because, and this is per Proust's theory, but also some of my own thinking, you take your experience and you compare it to things, right? In some way. It doesn't have to be such an obvious comparison like, oh, like my anger is like fire. I mean, it could be something as simple as that, but it could be much more complex. It could be that you communicating the whole narrative of your upbringing through a book or through a painting or something like that. It could be very subtle and very complex comparisons. But basically, you're taking what it is to have experienced something and juxtaposing it with other things that it's related to, either similar or dissimilar. that's basically the metaphor. That's the word for it. Basically, that's happening, and that is how you are bringing out what's in that experience through these comparisons. Even when you put a word to an experience, you are in a way already metaphorizing, because you're saying this experience was like this word. Right? We don't think about that as a thing, but actually, as soon as you take an experience and you put a word to it, now you're naming it, and now you have metaphorized it in a sense. So this entire process of metaphorization, which was important to me at a certain stage during my search, which I think will probably be important to other people during a stage of their search when they need to bring meaning out of suffering experiences, it was Proust who gave me that critical link, which is why I'm so grateful to him, and I think he's so important. His ideas are important to seekers. Not every seeker is going to be able to go through his immense 6-volume novel. It's a lot of time and effort. Not everybody's prepared for it. Not everybody wants it, which I fully understand. But, reading it has a lot of pleasure, like I say, even outside this point. It's incredibly beautiful. It's very psychologically and sociologically observant. It's probably the greatest novel ever written. But from the spiritual standpoint, that's what it contributed to me. So the question is, hi, I started inquiring a little while ago, and I find a heavy and persistent habit of trying to get something, more particularly trying to grasp something that I could say, this is myself. Well, that's the mind's way of trying to get it. And every time this grasping action happens, it's simply a matter of persistence that you have to turn from that action. You don't necessarily have to even stop that action. Just ask yourself, and you don't even have to do this asking in words. Just redirect your attention to who's grasping. In fact, who's noticing the grasping. The grasping action is itself a thought that occurs in whose awareness? In my awareness. So who's that I? Which again, it need not be in words that you say that. You simply have to redirect your attention to the simple clarity by which you know that you exist in that moment, by which you know that you are aware of that grasping. So let the mind grasp if it wants. It doesn't matter. Every time it grasps, just notice the grasping itself occurs in awareness. The awareness occurs to me. And put your attention on the me. Of course, what are you putting your attention on when you put your attention on the me? That's the big question, isn't it? And if you think that you've put your attention on the me successfully, then you should examine what it is that you think you've put your attention on. Because what can be an object of your attention is not the true self. So, you think you put your attention inward, then what you think you think you've done that, but then what you've actually done is you've thought a thought, or you have your attention on a feeling, and then you notice that. And then again you say, but who's aware of this noticing? Me. And again you redirect. And again, you relentlessly redirect to the fact that I know that I am in every second, in every moment of experience. That fact is clear. Of course, attending to it can be slippery, but you keep doing it over and over again. Whatever arises, let it be a grasping action or anything else, redirect. Let the mind do whatever it wants. It can think whatever it likes. It can feel whatever it wants. It doesn't matter. Because whatever is felt, whatever is thought, whatever is perceived, it's happening in a continuous stream of awareness that occurs to I. So it's like a mirror. Whatever the mirror reflects, it's still a mirror. So you're noticing that reflective quality. It's reflecting back at the one who's watching what's happening in the mirror, which is the I. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the mind has a tendency to grasp. You can use that grasping tendency to reflect back on the one who is noticing the grasping. Does that make sense? I'm glad. The question is the spacious mind state obvious when it happens? The spacious mind is something I refer to in my book as a kind of inversion of the I. It's a kind of glimpse of what the I really is. And the answer is yes, it's obvious when it happens. It should be a radical shift in perspective regarding what the I is. And it should be a state of peace and clarity, even with your eyes open. But other than that, it should be very clear. If it isn't very clear, it isn't it. Yeah, it should be pretty much without a doubt very obvious. Now, usually when you reflect on it and say, oh, is this it or isn't it it? Typically, you're already out of it if you were in it. Because, yes, when it actually is the case, it's quite indisputable, I think. It's what Ramana Maharshi used to call the I. Like you'd have the I, and then you have the I-I, which is the spacious mind. And the spacious mind really is just the self, with the one difference that the spacious mind it's a state rather than continuous. The reason it's a state is because of ignorance, because of the reassertion of old mental habits that take you out of that state. But that state, which is not really a state, it's simply the truth, is actually, it's the self. It just doesn't seem that way because you cut in and out of it. So the fact that you're cutting in and out of it, or seeming to cut in and out of it anyway, is what makes it provisional instead of final. In a way, getting to the spacious mind is sort of like falling asleep, right? You can't really force yourself there. In fact, if you try to force yourself to fall asleep, it's the best way of staying awake, right? So you inquire and you inquire, or you surrender and you surrender, and that takes you near this sort of black hole. But it's only kind of when, in a moment of your ego's weakness, and it sort of releases its grip for a second, and it's sucked in. That's when you get to the spacious mind. You can't force yourself there. If you're trying to get there, you won't get there. You have to try to either surrender or to inquire at what it is that wants to get to the spacious mind, right? That's a useful inquiry. Look at the I of that. I want to get to the spacious mind. So just to let everyone know, this is only going for about 4 more minutes, so any other questions, feel free to ask. There'll be more live satsangs in the future for sure, hopefully many, many more. So there'll be other opportunities as well. But if you do have any questions that you want to ask now, in the next few minutes, now is the time. So about 8 months ago, I had some kind of non-dual experience. I didn't do any kind of yoga or meditation. I was just sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden, everything I saw went radically different, except the colors and shapes. Or I guess, okay, right. So radically different. How exactly? Yes. So when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see what I normally call me. I did see my face, but it wasn't like mine. So yeah, this sounds like a glimpse of the truth, is what it sounds like. That's what I call these kinds of experiences, which are affect the boundaries of your identity. It sounds like you had a little glimpse of the truth, which can definitely happen to people, whether or not they do yoga or meditation. In fact, it often is what draws people to spirituality in the first place, is the fact that they've had one of these glimpses. But if you want, of course, to, well, I mean, sure. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. So you're asking, is it really a glimpse? It was insane. Yeah, I mean, certainly from conventional perspective, truth is a kind of insanity. So, um, if you felt like your identity was totally altered in that way, I mean, it sounds to me like a glimpse. I mean, it may not necessarily have been an incredibly peaceful glimpse. I'm not sure. It sounds like maybe it was a little fearful, but you saw that there is a disconnect between who you thought you were and who you actually were, and that is precisely the nature of truth realization. So you had a little touch of that. Does that sound about right? It went away after about an hour. Yeah, that sounds about right. Exactly, a glimpse, precisely. And who knows what precipitated it? It might have been your particular mental state at the time. Could have been any number of things, but it did seem to bring you further into spirituality. So it's definitely a good thing. So, all right, this satsang is concluded, and as I said, I will certainly have more in the future. So thank you all for being with me, and if you have any further questions in between, feel free to visit my website and shoot me an email. Uh, Otherwise, be well. Sorry, a final question. I see. Can this become a permanent thing? It was great, so peaceful. Um, the answer is that it cannot be a permanent thing as a state. You see, you had it as a glimpse. Glimpses, the permanent thing is not that glimpse extended. The permanent thing is what the glimpse refers to. So yes, in a sense, it can be permanent, but it won't be permanent in the not quite in the way that you think it will be. But it did kind of open a window onto something that not only can be permanent, but is already permanent. And that there is simply a misconception in your mind, which we call ignorance, which is preventing you from seeing that, and which it is the purpose of self-inquiry to that cut that veil. Does that make sense? I'm sure it requires more to digest. All right, good. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.